Hey, sixth grade, here's your notes on percents to fractions and decimals. Before we start, let's make sure we all know what a percent is, and it's a ratio that's being compared to 100. So it's like something out of 100, and this right here is the symbol that's used to show that we're talking about a percent. First, we're going to look at how to change a percent to a decimal. So if we remember that a percent is out of 100, then we know in order to say something is out of 100, it's like dividing by 100. And if we were to divide something by 100, if we think back to especially like scientific notation, dividing by 100 is the same thing as multiplying by 10 to the negative second. So really what we're doing when we're dividing a number by 100 is we are just moving the decimal places 2 to the left. So if we look at the first example, we have 3%. The decimal in 3% is going to start behind the number since there's not one there. And then if we have to move it 2 to the left in order to show that we're dividing it by 100, we're going to go 1, 2. We can put a placeholder 0 in that spot, and then we would come up with 3% is 3 hundredths, which makes sense because it's technically 3 out of 100. This next one, even though it has a decimal in it, since it also has the percent sign, it's still a percent. So if we want to take that percent and change it into a decimal, same thing, we're going to find our decimal and move it twice to the left because it's the same thing as dividing it by 100. We can put in that placeholder 0, and 4 3/10% would be 43 hundredths as a decimal. Number 3, we have 642%. There's no decimal, so we're going to put the decimal at the end. We need to take it and move it twice. So this one might be a little tricky just because you're like, wait, but there's another number. Nope, but that's okay because we're only going to move it 2 times, which means there might be another whole number there. So 642% would be 6 42 hundredths as a decimal. The reason that you still have this whole number here is since this percentage is over 100, that means that you have more than one whole, because 100% represents having one whole of something. So if we have 642%, then we have 6 wholes or complete things, and then 42%, or 6 42 hundredths. And this last one, the one thing that I want to remind you of is even though there's already a decimal there, since it has a percent sign, it's still a percent. So to take that percent and change it into a decimal, we still have to take our decimal and move it twice to the left because it's like dividing by 100. We can add a 0 placeholder and we would come up with this as our answer as a decimal. So that's all you have to do when you're changing a percent to a decimal. Now, if we switch over to percents to fractions, I think it's super important to still keep in mind what we talked about how a percent is out of 100, and if it's out of 100, that's like dividing by 100. Remember, if we're thinking about a fraction and a division problem are the same exact thing. So your percents are always going to be over 100. If you think about that, in my opinion, that makes that way easier. Or if you think about the fact that you're dividing it by 100. So 3% is saying that that number or that thing is 3 out of 100. So to write that as a fraction, it would just be 3 out of 100. 21 3/10% is saying that it's 21 3/10 out of 100. So if we're writing that as a fraction, or a comparison even, it's 21 3/10 over 100. The tricky thing with a problem like this is since you have a decimal place there, remember I don't really like decimals in my fractions because it's just like a part of a part. We don't need all that. And we can easily simplify that. So in order to make it so that we don't have a decimal there, I can just multiply both my numerator and my denominator by 10. Because remember, if I'm multiplying it by 10, that's taking my decimal and moving it once, which is exactly what I want to do. So what I would end up with here is 213 over 1,000. And that can't be simplified, so that is where my answer would stay. The next example is 125%. So when we think about this, we just go back to, well, that's 125 out of 100. From here, we can go ahead and simplify it. If you want, you can keep your answer as a mixed number, or you can leave it as an improper fraction. But either way that you do it, we need to simplify it. The easiest way to simplify something like this is to look at the number 5 and 0. Since this ends in 5 and the other number ends in 0, I know that thinking back to my divisibility rules, both of these can be divided by 5. So if I divide my numerator and my denominator by 5, then I'm going to come up with 25 over 20. And if you actually need to go to the side and do that division, please feel free to. I don't expect you guys to do this in your head unless you totally feel comfortable doing so, which is awesome too, by the way. 25 and 20 can still be simplified though, because one ends in a 5 and the other ends in a 0. So once again, it's still divisible by 5. So I'm going to divide my numerator and denominator by 5, and I will get that is 5 over 4. You can leave your answer like this or switch it to a mixed number, which would be 1 1/4. The last one looks kind of tricky, looks kind of crazy, but it's not too bad. So we have 3 1/5%. Now we know 3 1/5% is just like saying 3 1/5 out of 100. We also know that this fraction sign right there is another way of writing a division problem. So if I go ahead and I set this up as a division problem, I have 3 1/5 divided by 100. Remember, you can take that 100 and make it into a fraction by just writing 100 over 1. Now, if we think about how we need to divide fractions, well, the first thing is I need to take this 3 1/5 and change it into an improper fraction. So 5 times 3 is 15, plus 1 is 16. So I have 16/5 divided by 100 over 1. And then I know I need to do keep, change, flip. So I'm going to have 16/5 times 1 over 100. I would totally suggest cross-simplifying from here. So both of these are divisible by 4. 16 divided by 4 is 4. 100 divided by 4 is 25. So now from here, all I'm going to do is multiply. So 4 times 1 is 4. 5 times 25 is 125. And that would be your final answer. So 3 1/5% as a fraction would be 4 over 125. If you got confused anywhere along there, please let me know. Number 4 I think can be kind of tricky. Just so you know, another way you could think about number 4 is by changing this fraction into a decimal and then working out the problem the same way that we did number 2. If you have any questions on this though, please let me know, and y'all have an amazing rest of the day.